In her famous work on Germany, published in 1813, the famous Salonier Madame de Staël wrote the following: "We could extract a lot of brilliant ideas on all kinds of topics from Kant's writings. In fact, his doctrine may well be the only one from which we can get ingenious new insights nowadays, since the materialist perspective no longer offers us anything interesting or original on any topic. The cream of the jest about serious, noble, divine topics has been skimmed, and the only way for us to make the human race young again is by returning through philosophy to religion and through reason to sentiment." And I think that despite the common association of French thought in the 18th century with secularism and desacralization, it's interesting to note dissident voices like de Staël, who advocated for the supportive topics of the transcendent, topics like religion, God, Christianity, etc. As a little background for some of the inspiration for this, I think a cultural phenomenon that has been on my mind for a long time is the idea of groups of people gathered around common intellectual interests. Of course, one of the groups that has particularly fascinated me is the Inklings, which, as you know, included J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. It was a group of small writers based in England, a group of scholars that just met around literary discussion. And I think, judging from the output that some of these men had and the influence that they've had on the broader modern Christian literary scene, we can kind of presume that this group was really instrumental in giving them that background. And then I've also had some personal experience with this. A group of us started meeting on Sundays around 2 years ago to just talk about literature every Sunday morning. And that's just been a source of inspiration, fellowship for me that I will always remember. So I think it was a pretty easy choice to decide on French salons of the 18th and 19th centuries. So just a little bit of background on the cultural phenomenon of salons. I think some prominent aspects of them, they were started in the 17th century, and their heyday was kind of in the 18th. But one unmistakable aspect of the French salons was their celebration of the salonier, the woman who hosted the gathering and also served as its moderator. And there's a prominent scholar that writes that by the 1760s, the Parisian salons, already at the center of Parisian social and intellectual life, had become centers of enlightenment. 17th century women had created the salon as an undifferentiated social space that valued ideas and fostered discussion of them. Another important aspect is that these often occurred in homes, the homes of these women. There was one salonier du Deffand who would gather people around 1 o'clock in the afternoon for dinner, and then a couple hours, like 4 to 5 hours of discussion afterwards. And you could literally hop around from salon to salon in Paris because different saloniers would hold their salons intentionally on different days so that philosophers and intellectuals just could kind of move around. It was a place for social interaction and intellectual feedback. Conversation was the main purpose of a salon, as Mark Cartwright writes. A good salon guest had something to bring to this conversation, at the very least wit and elegant French. Those gifted with particular skills were especially appreciated. Writers, painters, musicians, and philosophers were particularly valued by their hosts, since they could not only guarantee entertainment for the other guests, but also reveal avant-garde trends in their respective fields. So, of course, to orient my own discussion of salons, I had to refer to the scholarship, which is decently sized. I'm going to talk about 3 of these scholars. So, starting off with Jürgen Habermas, whose picture you see there. He's an extremely influential scholar in the 20th century on social issues. And he published a book called The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, where he talks about salons, but also this idea of a public space. And I like how the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy summarizes this. The public space is where private individuals come together to communicate about matters of general concern. It is the location of the public use of reason and the place where public opinion is formed. So Habermas, of course, recognizes salons as being kind of part and parcel of this formation of the public sphere, and emphasizes their discussional qualities, their ability to bring people together from different social castes to an area of just rational discussion and informal debate. And I think he helps orient my study in just emphasizing that salons were centers of French society, that they promoted a certain level of equality and rational discussion. Another very prominent interpretation is Dina Goodman. She had a very influential book called The Republic of Letters, A Cultural History of the French Enlightenment. And her interpretation of the salons is primarily gendered. She's really, really focused on talking about salons and not underestimating the women who ran them. She wrote that the French Enlightenment was grounded in a female-centered, mixed-gender sociability that gendered French culture, the Enlightenment, and civilization itself as feminine. So very, very strong take. on the gendered quality of these salons. And she's very concerned that historians haven't taken enough time to talk about these women seriously. And then finally, Susan Tenenbaum kind of opens the door for salons as centers of aesthetic discussion. She talks about the Coppet Circle, which we'll talk about later on, and also brings out the connections between salons and Romanticism, particularly the Coppet Circle. So where does my thesis fit into all this? Many of the figures that I discuss in my project, Madames de Staël, Récamier, Beaumont, as well as A.W. Schlegel, Benjamin Constant, and Chateaubriand are absolutely fundamental to an ideological and social history of the 18th and 19th centuries. All of these figures were either saloniers or attendees of various salons in European society. I, in particular, analyzed Germaine de Staël and Chateaubriand's lives and personal beliefs, as well as their prominent connections like A.W. Schlegel and Pauline de Beaumont. With this inquiry, I seek to demonstrate that salons and those that attended them were not simply concerned with the secular, but also the religious. So as we've seen, like a lot of these interpretations are focusing on some aspect of the salon's civic, social, gendered effect. But what they're not talking about, at least in depth or with a lot of focus, like I'm doing here, is the salon's interaction with topics of the religious or topics of the transcendent. So a prominent salon that we'll be talking about is the Coppet Circle, and this was headed up by Germaine de Staël. It also included visitors like A.W. Schlegel and Benjamin Constant in Switzerland. And one of the important things about the salon was that both Germaine de Staël and Schlegel, who we'll be talking about, were both very, very prominent Romantic voices. It's notoriously hard to define in scholarly terms what Romanticism is, but generally speaking, I like the summarization again by the Stanford Encyclopedia. In Romanticism, the aesthetic, most broadly that which concerns beauty and art, is not just one aspect of human life or one branch of the humanistic studies. Rather, if the Romantic ideal is to materialize, aesthetics should permeate and shape human life. Friedrich Schlegel, one of the leading figures in early German Romanticism, put this idea in a few memorable phrases. The Romantic imperative demands that all nature and science should become art, and art should become nature and science. Poetry and philosophy should be united, and life and society should be made poetic. So it's important to keep this, I think, ideological backdrop in mind, especially when we talk about de Staël, Schlegel, and then also Chateaubriand, who was another Romantic voice. So coming back to de Staël, who lived from 1766 to 1817, I really like this quote by de Chassaigne. There were three great powers struggling against Europe for the soul of Europe: England, Russia, and Madame de Staël. And an overstatement, but it just goes to show her perceived impact, I think, on the European intellectual scene. She was a salonier, as this says, at Paris and Coppet. And her parents were interesting. So Jacques Necker was her father. He was a premier finance minister that served King Louis XVI. He had written a book called Of the Importance of Religious Opinions, and her mother was also extremely devout. And her mother was also salonier. So you can see that kind of this combination of a devout family with an intersection with a lot of French sociability from a young age, I think really influenced her. She wrote in her memoirs that my drawing room became again filled, and I had once more the pleasure of conversing in Paris, which I confess has always been to me the most fascinating of all pleasures. This love of conversation probably inspired her two salons, one held in Paris and the other at a chateau in Coppet. And within these salons, she was able to meet and converse with many powerful French intellectuals and leaders. So a little bit on her actual religious philosophy. She was extremely anti-materialistic. She was not an atheist. And then furthermore, she had a very strong association between morality and God. A lot of her theology seems very deistic, even though she had Protestant parents. So I'll just read you a quote here from On Literature, which was published in 1800. She wrote, "The Reformation is the historical period which has been of most real use to the perfectibility of the human race." Strong topic sentence. "Protestant religion has no living seed of superstition within its breast and still gives virtue the support provided by sensitive opinions. The Protestant religion is not a hindrance to philosophical inquiry in countries where it is professed, and it is a very effective way of maintaining pure moral standards. To go into this question at length would be a digression, but let me ask enlightened thinkers for a way to link morality to the idea of a God without letting it become an instrument of power in the hands of men. Would such a religion not be the greatest good one could ensure for human nature?" So I think a couple elements we can see here. One, an affirmation that that God exists, and then another just an extreme respect for Protestantism as kind of a civilizing and moralizing effect on people. And then also kind of, this is also reflected earlier in the revolution, just this idea that religion has been perverted by the priests and the Catholic Church, and that we need to return to a way more pure understanding of morality that's still grounded in God. Interestingly, she also bases her understanding on femininity on the transcendent. So she essentially views Christianity and its God as the basis for a just view of gender equality, and she blames society for its abuses of femininity, but affirms the transcendent God of Christianity as the ground for equality and justice. So moving on to A.W. Schlegel, who was a close friend of de Staël and a regular attendee of the Coppet Circle. He's a cornerstone of German Romanticism, and he gave a series of lectures that was published between 1809 and 1816 in Vienna. And I think that this quote right here needs to be given further attention. He says, "Religion is the root of human existence. Were it possible for man to renounce all religion, including that which is unconscious, independent of the will, he would become a mere surface without any internal substance." And this is what has actually taken place in modern Europe through the introduction of Christianity. This sublime and beneficent religion has regenerated the ancient world from its state of exhaustion and debasement. It is the guiding principle in the history of modern nations. He goes on further to say that the impressions of the senses are to be hallowed, as it were, by a mysterious connection with higher feelings. And the soul, on the other hand, embodies its forebodings or indescribable intuitions of infinity in types and symbols borrowed from the ancient world. So again, like de Staël, a deep respect for religion as a force of civilization, bringing a sense of morality to like the barbarous Middle Ages, for instance, and a deep respect for the infinite and the transcendent, things that can't really be finitized like everybody in the Enlightenment wanted to do. And then, of course, last but not least, the Viscount François-René de Chateaubriand, and he lived from 1768 to 1848. He had quite a colorful life. He was a noble, he was a soldier, a politician, a writer. He had a very faithful Catholic mother that influenced him from a young age. He went through a period of skepticism in his life, and then in England, he had this conversion, as he records in his memoirs. And he says, "I became a Christian. I did not yield, I must admit, to great supernatural enlightenment. My conviction came from the heart. I wept, and I believed." And he also attended the salons of the Comtesse de Beaumont, who we'll look at in a little bit, and Juliette Récamier, so he was very abolic with these salon circles, and was also a close friend with de Staël. It's amazing how so many of these people are just connected. But he's most famous for writing his book, Le Génie du Christianisme, The Genius of Christianity. The influence of this book was massive. Charles White, who writes the preface to his translation of it, writes, "In 2 years it had passed through 7 editions. And such was the popularity it acquired that it was translated into the Italian, German, and Russian languages. In France, the Friends of Religion hailed it as the olive branch of peace and hope, a messenger of heaven sent forth to solace the general affliction, to heal the wounds of so many desolate hearts after that frightful deluge of impiety which had laid waste that unfortunate country." But of course, he wasn't just a lone wolf writing about religion. I think his discussions on the transcendent were catalyzed and influenced by his relationships, especially with prominent Saloniers such as Pauline de Beaumont. So she was, as per usual, a Parisian Salonier and a countess. And she, after Chateaubriand came back from America in one of his travels, she really extended her hospitality to him and became his friend. He attended her salon weekly, actually daily, and found just a lot of community and friendship. Louis Fontenay was another staunch Catholic that actually introduced him to Beaumont and got him part of this salon. And she liked him so much that she actually invited him to her house in the countryside to work on his work, just to have a space to work and write. And he writes of this experience that I withdrew to start work. Madame de Beaumont had the goodness to copy out the quotations which I marked for her. This noble woman offered me shelter when I had none. Without the peace which she gave me, I might never have finished a work which I had been unable to complete during my misfortunes. So again, a very influential Salonier that he was involved with, and that probably without which he wouldn't have been able to publish this very monumental work on Christianity, which talked about a ton of things, from priests to the mysteries of the Christian religion to sacraments. And then again, another Salonian that came into prominence, especially in his later life, was Juliette Recamier. And she was a Salonian that was particularly renowned for her beauty. She was extremely popular in Paris, and also close friends with Madame de Staël and Chateaubriand. She later on in life held a salon at the Abbaye aux Bois. And basically what she did here was she not only gave him friendship again, which is something he really desperately needed. He was quite a wanderer and really emotionally unstable. But she helped to critique and popularize his memoirs, which he had been writing throughout his life. And basically what would happen is that he would bring a section of his memoirs to her, and they would read them like the hour before the salon met. And then they would be read aloud by another man in the salon, and everybody would clap and think it was great. So I think it really boosted his ego, but it also helped to popularize and disseminate his thoughts in his memoirs. And these memoirs record his religious experiences and the conversion that we read about. So finally, to kind of his main work, The Genius of Christianity, or The Spirit and Beauty of the Christian Religion. It was published in 1802, and this is the quote that I read earlier about its immense popularity in Europe at the time. And I think Chateaubriand's purpose, he viewed it as a response to skepticism. He realized that France had been just kind of overwhelmed with the spirit of skepticism. He mentions Voltaire a lot as to blame for that. Also, like the encyclopedists like D'Alembert. And he also, interestingly, kind of starts with a history of skepticism and the church throughout history. He identifies Julian the Apostate early on as a very prominent skeptic that Christian intellectuals had to combat. And then he identifies Voltaire as kind of like the inheritor of this spirit of skepticism that he was also trying to combat. So he saw himself in this very historical tradition as kind of a bulwark of orthodoxy. And as he states in his preface, it was therefore necessary to prove that, on the contrary, the Christian religion of all the religions that ever existed is the most humane, the most favorable to liberty and to the arts and sciences, that the modern world is indebted to it for every improvement, from agriculture to the abstract sciences, from the hospitals for the reception of the unfortunate to the temples reared by the Michelangelos and embellished by the Raphaels. It was necessary to prove that nothing is more divine than its morality, nothing more lovely and more sublime than its tenets, its doctrine, and its worship, that it encourages genius, corrects the taste, develops the virtuous passions, imparts energy to the ideas, presents noble images to the writer and perfect models to the artist, that there is no disgrace in being believers with Newton and Bossuet, with Pascal and Racine. In a word, it was necessary to summon all the charms of the imagination and all the interests of the heart to the assistance of that religion against which they had been set in right. He kind of had a way with words, as you can see. But yeah, he was trying to marshal especially the aesthetic elements of Christianity and just its rich tradition of scholars and intellectuals and artists, and saying, like, it's not dumb to believe in Christianity. We're in league with all these scholars and minds that have gone before us. And he really, really tried, kind of as a romantic, to bring about an understanding of the beauties of the Christian religion. So I'm going to try to reveal two strands that I think he was agreeing with and then arguing against. So I think first against skepticism, he's kind of responding to Diderot and D'Alembert's encyclopédie, which radically emphasized this philosophy of empiricism, that the senses were what led you to knowledge. So a rational deduction from sensual experience was what led you to knowledge, not revealed theology. He says, Chateaubriand talks about them. He says that age when all the attainments of the human mind were ranged in alphabetical order in the Encyclopédie, that babble of the sciences and reason. And Chateaubriand just says that, like, reason isn't sufficient. He questions the supremacy of reason, and contra kind of some of this very rational scientific dialogue of Diderot and D'Alembert, he says that he affirms mystery. He affirms Christian mysteries like the Eucharist, the sacraments, etc. He says, long shall we remember the days when men of blood pretended to erect altars to the virtues. On the ruins of Christianity, those temples where once was found that God who is acknowledged by the whole universe, and where devotion to Mary consoled so many afflicted hearts. Those temples were dedicated to truth, which no man knows, and to reason, which never dried a tear. And I think it's important to note that Chateaubriand's philosophy remains firmly incarnational. He is not a deist. He's not maybe quite as high flown as like Schlegel and de Staël would have been. He affirms the traditional dogmatic particulars of Christianity, like the resurrection, the incarnation, things that, especially like de Staël, I didn't find much, reference to in her writings. Even though she affirmed this idea of God being kind of a moral lawgiver, he was much more explicit in saying that no, Christianity as a dogmatic conception of the universe is true, it's real, it's mysterious, and pretty much so be it. And then secondly, I feel that, so yeah, this is just, again, what I was saying, affirmation of the incarnation of the Eucharist, affirmation of dogmatic particulars, etc. But then secondly, I feel that an intellectual forerunner that he actually also mentions favorably in The Genius of Christianity was Blaise Pascal. It's amazing how many similarities I think are between Pascal and Chateaubriand. So both kind of had this like mystical experience with the transcendent, Chateaubriand when he was younger and then Pascal when he was older. Their conversions were both very like heartfelt and emotional. We all know about Pascal's Night at Fire, his mystical experience with kind of sensing the presence of Christ. And Pascal also, like Chateaubriand, doubts the sufficiency of reason. He says, we know the truth not only through our reason, but also through our heart. And then finally, Pascal also affirms this idea of a God that's incarnational and that's present, that isn't just a source for morality, but he's a source of life. He says the Christian's God does not consist merely of a God who is the author of mathematical truths and the order of the elements. The God of the Christians is a God of love and consolation. He is a God who fills the soul and heart of those whom he possesses. And I feel like Chateaubriand kind of carries on this intellectual conservative Catholic legacy of Pascal in trying to respond to some of these very skeptical voices at the Enlightenment. And all the while doing this, in the context of the prominent socialites that he's around, including the Salons and Saloniers. So finally, conclusions and questions. I'm just going to read here. I said, to conclude, I would like to once again restate that my work has here attempted to show that Saloniers and the people that attended them had a lot to say on transcendent topics, things like God, religion, and Christianity specifically. Salons were not just centers of religious discourse, but Salons were not just centers of secular discourse, but religious discourse as well. And I think it's important to ask the question, like, why or so what? Like, why does all this research matter? And I think the question is just like, what does elite, French sociability have to do with a contemporary church? How does it apply? And I think if anything, the salons and the literary and ideological power that flowed out of them demonstrate the power of human connection and conversation to build culture and to increase thought. And I think perhaps the principle of gathering together around shared passions is applicable to our own times in creating what Roger calls a vibrant counterculture that he says is necessary for the health of the contemporary church.